Thank you, Tom, for the introduction, and thanks for coming back. It's not like a course where you have to come back, so I realize you're here voluntarily, and I appreciate that very much. Last week, in case you weren't here, it is online and you can listen to it again if you want to catch up. But last week we talked about a broken unity. Was it a broken unity or was it moral decline after the founders were finished with the country? I mean, they set us up. So the three main things that were happening to cause people to either say the country was in moral decline, religious people saying that, or that it was just broken unity, was rapid industrialization, if you remember, and it challenged the traditional role of family and church. Then there was the arrival of more than 1 million Catholic immigrants. The earlier groups were mostly Irish and Catholic, but the Germans had come earlier. They didn't cause much of a stir, the Germans, but the Irish started this whole anti-immigrant, fear of immigrant trend. I mean, the country's had this for quite a while, this problem. And then, excuse me, the debate over the abolition of slavery, that was huge. And when we talk about broken unity, that's really the clincher, because that's obviously half of the country seceded. So that's a little review. But today I want to talk about the turn of the century in the early 1900s. And then next week will be the final part of the series, and we'll talk about the mid-1900s to today. And most of us were here for that, so it'll be familiar. But what I want to talk about today is some of the roots of the things that have led to the situations we're in now, where we think it's so disruptive and that politics and religion are like intertwined in a bad way. Actually, a lot of that started back then. So let's go into that. There were multiple issues, and there's a lot of them, so I'm not going to be able to cover them all, but just so you know, this was a huge change, time of change, just like now. And so the turn of the century, going from the 1800s to the 1900s, was very disruptive for people, just like now. It's similar. So here's all the issues, the many, many issues that were going on. We saw industrialization start in the 1800s, but it accelerated in the 1900s. Big business was not just coming along, but was almost taking over. And that's similar to now. We talk about that. There were increasing numbers of rich and increasing numbers of poor. When people moved from the farms to the cities, their lives changed dramatically. Some did well and a lot did not do well. So we'll look at that briefly. And if you see the series, The Gilded Age, it becomes clear that there were some very, very, very rich people. That's on Netflix, right? Is it?
I can remember.
HBO. It was good. Okay, and then there were urban problems and rural problems that were unexpected. Immigration continued and accelerated. There was a lot of corruption in government. And for the religious element, the gospel of wealth, there were people, and I'll cover this, there were people who thought that was God's blessing on you if you're really rich. Prohibition is huge. I've done a lot of work on prohibition. That was, in the 1800s, there was a temperance movement. So it didn't just start in the 1900s, but it accelerated and then went legal. Women's suffrage, if you remember, that was huge. And the thing I think I'm most interested in covering is the fundamentalist modernist controversy, because that's the roots of what we see now in this conservative liberal tension in churches, in Christianity. So that I'll spend a little bit more time on, but we'll just cover some of these things. But you can see there was a lot going on, a real lot going on. So what about industrialization? What happened? Well, they were creating factories. There was some new technology which they wanted to use, and they were creating factories. But what happened was they needed workers, and there really were hardly any laws governing this. So there was a lot of young women, excuse me, a lot of young women went to work in factories. They were often locked in. You've heard about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. I mean, they were locked in. So when the fire started, they couldn't even get out, and they were jumping out of windows. And that's actually prompted some laws finally. And then there was children that were pressed into service, not just because they wanted to misuse children, but because families that had moved from the farm to the cities could not support themselves. They could barely eat. And so everyone had to work in the family. It wasn't just like, hey, Johnny's bored, let's send him to work. They had to work. And these were dangerous conditions. And you can see they were so close to in both cases, so close to the machines that it's not surprising that they got hurt. And there were no laws protecting them. And that's, amazing. Now, what about religion? Where did religion fit in here? Well, some people just felt that this was moral decline, which in a way it really was, but it was challenging that idea that the good family was on a farm. They did work, the children worked, yes, but they were supervised by their parents. They weren't in an alien environment, and it was okay. So I'm sure there were farming accidents too, but this challenged the idea of what a family was supposed to be in America. And then the Victorian ideals for rich people could not be realized by poor people, but the ideals were the same, that the woman stays home, she tends the hearth, she raises the kids religiously, she's there to welcome her husband, she doesn't work outside the home, and she's like almost has a religious function. Well, that sounds lovely and romantic, but hardly anybody except rich people could do that. Poor people couldn't do it. So they probably almost felt guilty that they had to do this, but they had to eat. That was number one. And the housing conditions were terrible. Tuberculosis was rampant. They were in close quarters. There was the urban environment was crowded and dirty, and there were carts all over the streets. My mother grew up in a tenement in New York City, and my grandmother too. And we went to the tenement museum. I think I went one time before Joe, and I went by myself. I was visiting somebody in New York. So I went to the tenement museum, and I had almost an enlightenment experience. I hate to call it that, but it was like an awakening. So I saw the tenement museum, which was an actual tenement in New York on the Lower East Side, which is where a lot of Jews, Italians, and immigrants were. And they explained how the laws had tried to, after so many people were dying and getting TB, fires and everything, they tried to explain how they were improving it, but the improvements weren't very improving. The tenement that I saw, which was a typical tenement, had maybe I forget how many units per floor, and there was maybe 4 floors. There was one bathroom for everybody in the hall. It was dirty. It was disgusting. They had nowhere else to go. There might have been an outhouse on the outside in the square, and I wish I had a picture of it. There was a front room which had 2 windows onto the street. That became like the living room kind of. Then there was a middle room that had no windows, and that became the kitchen. And it had everything in there, all the cooking, the water, everything was right in that one room. And that's it for water. And then the back room was a bedroom. But usually the families were so poor that they had to rent out the bedroom to people to make enough money to pay their rent. So when the government realized that people were getting TB and they were getting diseases, and they were also making little things, little flowers and things for the clothing industry, everybody had to work. So they bring these things home for the kids to work on and the women. Is that a problem? Anyway, so they realized there was no ventilation, right? Just 2 windows in the front. Now there was an air shaft by the bedroom, but that didn't do much. So they said, well, you have to have ventilation, you have to have windows. So you know what the owners of the tenements did? They cut a window into the wall of the kitchen so it looked out onto the living room, and that's it. And visiting there, I imagine how you would feel if you lived, if you had to sleep, if you were a child there and you had to sleep on a bed, which was basically 2 chairs pushed together at night, and that was your bed, and you were 8 kids, a mother and a father, if you were lucky, and a boarder, and you're all crowded into this room. And I thought, oh, that explains everything, because the Jewish side of my family they were easily annoyed. And I'm like, oh, I get it. If I had grown up like that, I would be annoyed all the time, and it would just become part of your personality. So it was good for me to appreciate how my family had grown up and how difficult. And my mother said she didn't even like to go outside because there was all these push carts, people selling things, people, funny smells. You couldn't even walk. It had to be hard, really hard. So they got sick a lot and they died. But it wasn't that great on the farm because a lot of people were leaving to go to the city. So they had less workers. Now, the farming was difficult anyway, just to begin with, but different weather conditions. And then of course, later on the Dust Bowl and all that and the Depression meant that it wasn't so great and romantic on the farm anymore either. So what about religion? Well, religion often blamed people for these conditions, not everybody. I mean, there was other elements that wanted to reform and fix, but a lot of them said, well, they're just suffering because they aren't saved or they're not behaving right. And of course, there was a lot of problems in the cities with drinking and all that. And oftentimes people felt guilty because they weren't living the Victorian life of the woman at home and the guy going downtown on the trolley. So what else was going on? Corruption in government. Just to get child labor laws passed, I mean, it was difficult, just like now. It's hard to get stuff passed that we know is good for us, like gun control, right? So this picture is all these poor workers supporting these rich capitalists on top, see that? And then this other picture is just, let it roll, just let it happen. I got money and I can do, it says do as you please, see? So there wasn't a lot of control going on and a lot of people were suffering, but it took our country, as always, a long time to figure this out, unfortunately. We seem to want to see a lot of suffering before we go, oh, well, maybe we should change something. So anyway, I don't think it would be a fun time. My husband always says he wants to live during the Victorian period. I said, yeah, if you were rich, it'd be fun. For everybody else, like my relatives, it wasn't fun. So that's the Gilded Age, right? And I highly recommend this series. I mean, there wasn't any tax, there were no taxes. So imagine they had all this money and they could do what they wanted with it. Now, that's where the gospel of wealth comes in because actually it's a misuse of Calvinism because people said, how can I know I'm saved? How can I prove it? And Calvin and Calvinism are different. Calvinism is like a degrading of Calvin. I actually think Calvin was a brilliant theologian and he's part of Reformed theology. And I got a lot out of reading him, but people misinterpreted him. He said, you can't really know if you're saved or not, but if God is blessing you, you probably are saved. Well, how blessed are those people? They're doing pretty well, right? So they just assumed that they were more righteous than other people. And as you could see in the Gilded Age, they did feel some obligation to the poor people and they felt sorry for them often. And so a lot of times the women who were not allowed, the husbands didn't want these rich women to work and they didn't actually have to. They would do a lot of charity work. So that was good. And while the richer women didn't necessarily create settlement houses, some devout Christian women felt that they were not really taking care of the poor very well, that the rich had an obligation. So this was good, but it was not controlled. The government was not stepping in and getting some taxes and distributing them fairly. So it was kind of a, good luck for you if you're poor, that there's a settlement house. And my mother, who was Jewish and poor, did go to settlement houses and learn, and they had good things going on, their cooking classes and all. Of course, they also told these immigrants that, oh my goodness, this pasta, this garlic, this is so unhealthy. You have to change your diet and be like us, be like the Protestants who were controlling the settlement houses. So it wasn't all perfect. It was mixed. So a lot of, as I'm saying, a lot of people felt that the Gilded Age was a gospel of wealth, that you were blessed and you were showing off to show how blessed you were. Look at these, look at that. They couldn't even figure out how to use the money that they had. And some people were using charity and building libraries and things like Carnegie, but not everybody did that. So you can see that wealth was a sign of God's blessing. See, there's the poor kids on this side doing bad things, right? And then there's the wealthy people being helped by Uncle Sam and angels to show that they were actually righteous. And then you can see there signs of grace. I mean, this was this was an ethos. This was a theology. And did it stay like that? Did people start figuring out that that wasn't really necessarily proof of your salvation? And this is mostly happening within Protestantism, okay? Which was a dominant force, especially in government. As we said the first week, they weren't all Orthodox Protestants, but they were all affected by that kind of ethos. What about immigration? The prejudice against immigrants got worse and worse. And I know all that personally because my parents and my grandparents were immigrants. On my mother's side, my grandfather, who I actually never met, things were not well at home. He was from Russia. And I think he was in a shtetl, of course, but he got out in time before too many pogroms happened. They were also forcing young men, even Jewish men, to go into the Russian military. So it was not a good time to live there if you were Jewish. And so they started coming later in the 1800s. The Irish came sooner, and you can see no Irish need apply. They seem to have no shame about this prejudice at all. They felt it was ruining America. Do you hear echoes from that to now? This has been going on quite a while. And then, the new transatlantic Hebrew line, they saw them as dirty, as corrupting the country. Many people were highly anti-Semitic. And let's be honest, the heritage of American Protestantism has a deep undercurrent of anti-Semitism. I still see it. I still feel it now. With my Jewish background, I'm sensitive to it. And I think we're trying to get over it. The Holocaust was like a wake-up call. Oh, really? Oh, okay. So it's a wake-up call, but it hasn't eradicated anti-Semitism in Protestantism or Catholicism. And Catholics were prejudiced against too. So, for various reasons. And I told you, I think last week, that the Italian Catholics came here, and the Irish Catholics, which by then, and the German Catholics by then were pretty much in control of the church, would often say, put them in the basement. Let's just have a mass down there. And so they started calling them the Bassamento Catholics. In other words, they had to go to the basement because they didn't like the way they smelled. They didn't like the way they looked. Now we're like, yeah, garlic, we love it. But back then, the people were prejudiced against you. And my father used to, if we had company coming over, my father, who was an Italian immigrant, would say, my mother's name was Gertrude, so he called her Jerry. He says, Jerry, I know you're making dinner for these people, but don't use a lot of garlic, okay? Just don't use a lot of garlic. And it was, it's sad, right? Now it's great, but it was sad because he didn't want people to be prejudiced. And my father said when he came over here, he was about 16. When he came over here, the Irish used to chase the Italians down the street. The boys would chase them down the street and beat them up. And my mother would talk about anti-Semitism. So I heard this all the time. All right, so how I ended up in a white Protestant church is kind of strange. And I'm not trying to make you feel guilty, but it's really important. And it's important that we know this, and it's important that we be careful now because the same things are happening now. So it's very important that we're aware of the roots of this. And some of the roots are in bad theology. That's why I ended up teaching theology. And my motto is bad theology kills. And I mean that literally. So was that all that was happening in Christianity? No, actually, some people did kind of get the point. Oh, wait a minute, I think we're hurting people, or at least they're suffering. We're Christians, shouldn't we help them? So there was a nice contingent of people that felt they needed to reach out to the poor. So, and by the way, as far as immigration, it wasn't just Jews and Italians, it was Greeks and Serbs and people from just, all over the world started coming here until they passed a law, I think it was 1924, where they made it by percentages. So the whatever percentage of your group was in America, that was the only percentage you were allowed to, that was allowed to immigrate. So if you had like if the country was 80% white Protestant, then, you know, if you were from England and you were that of that race, no problem, you could come in. If you only had 10%, I'm just, you know, get Greeks, let's say, then you could only have 10% of the allowed immigrants to be Greek. That really hurt people. Many people had come here, had come as they'd send the man maybe to make enough money to bring the rest of the family over. And when this law passed, sometimes they were separated forever because they couldn't get permission. They couldn't get a visa. They couldn't get an immigration status to bring in the other members of the family. So a lot of pain was being caused. So some Christians tried to insert themselves into this whole mess. So they saw it. Okay, they saw it. And they thought if they converted the immigrants and created charities to help them with a view to conversion, then that would help. And so kind of like the Salvation Army, I mean, this wasn't one of the earliest groups, but you know, with the Salvation Army, I think you have to go to the service before they let you have dinner. And so that's a heritage of, well, if we convert them, then they'll be better people and they won't, you know, they'll do better, but they'll also help the country be better because they're not bringing these strange habits with them, like drinking wine at a Seder for the Jews, or like having wine for communion, or like the Irish sending the son out with a bucket to go pick up some beer from the bar. They thought all that was just corrupting and moral decline. And some of it probably was, but some of it was just cultural. You know, wine at the Seder is a cultural thing. It's a religious thing. So the Christians some Christians tried to do this. And that's Amy Semple McPherson down there. She led revivals, which were super popular. And, you know, these are immigrants that are being preached to. And so they felt religion would solve all the problems. Now, I don't even know yet if religion could solve all our problems. If you're very devoted to your faith, you hope that good religion could solve the problems. But sometimes it makes problems, as we're seeing. So we don't have completely clean hands, okay? And a lot of times we're not even aware of it. So I'm not trying to make, again, although I have every flavor of guilt you could imagine, I'm not actually trying to put that on you. I'm just trying to say what's going on now isn't new, right? I think we're trying, but religion can also go bad, and we can have bad theology that hurts people. So, but there was another variation among Protestants, and this was huge. It was called the social gospel. Now, the social gospel movement was from about 1870 to 1920. It was really important from a theological and church perspective. So churches started to realize that they could actually help the situation. They could expand their social programs, not just about conversion, but about actually doing social action. And so they saw the poor working conditions, the schooling, the child labor, the crime, and they felt that maybe if they switched the focus, not just about conversion, but to something else, then they would actually make a difference. And what they became was critical of the system of the government, because what they also did was they said, you know what, this was a whole new thought. They went, you know, it's not just about individual sin. It's actually about social sin. People are pressed into these situations and they can't get out. And so the social conditions are causing the problems that they're suffering. And if we want to call it moral decline or just bad, you know, a bad environment, it's not because they're bad people, it's because the system is wrong. So this was a huge development, and we still have it today. So that's the root of social activism within Christianity, saying, oh, wait a minute, maybe when you live in the ghetto and the only option you have is to join a gang because otherwise they'll kill you anyway, and then the gang wants you to run drugs or whatever, well, you're alive. And so it's not an individual who had he or she grown up in a different family in a different neighborhood would take a completely different path. It's a social system that presses them into things that we want to call sin or things that hurt them and hurt others. That was a huge change. Walter Rauschenbusch is famous for this. And they still preached, they did all that, but what they really wanted to do was change the system and challenge the gospel of wealth. But in the end, unfortunately, the gospel of wealth triumphed in this country. And we're still in the midst of, I'm not saying I'm against capitalism, but capitalism, just like anything, can have excesses and be harmful. And the social gospel wanted to challenge that. And they did do a lot of good work, but in the end, there was still the gospel of wealth. So what's next? I mean, so many other things were going on. But the main thing one of the things I want to focus on, because I've done a lot of research on this, is prohibition. Prohibition was the law passed to not allow the trafficking of alcohol, and saloons and all were banned. It's the sale and trafficking of alcohol. But the temperance movement actually started in the 1800s. And there was a group called the Washingtonians who felt they were the first group to say, you know what, this isn't just moral failure, this is a disease. So that was a new thought. And the disease concept accelerated through time. And while it didn't become dominant until after Prohibition was repealed, because it worked really well for the alcohol industry to call it a disease, and only some people had it, other people didn't. What it did do was get people to question whether drinking was a personal sin. So they decided that actually it was something that you just shouldn't touch alcohol, because you would be liable to have this disease or get addicted or have this problem. So if you just never drank, no problem, right? Problem solved. And that's where Prohibition came from. So they weren't judging the alcoholics at that time or persons suffering from addiction. They actually took some of the judgment off, but they put it somewhere else. Where did they put it? They put it on immigrants. They put it on the cities. And I don't know if you know this, but Westerville, Ohio was the headquarters of the Anti-Saloon League, and they were very influential. And so it became kind of an urban versus rural, urban versus small town battle. And so it was all those dirty wine drinking immigrants versus us in our pure little Westerville town. And I'm not putting them down, because they analyzed a lot of things right. It's true. People that had to, if the man was coming home on Friday with his paycheck and he stopped off at the saloon and he drank it all up, yes, the children were not going to get any milk. And yes, the mother was upset. And yes, he might even beat her up when he got home. These were real problems. And a lot of the people were very public spirited, and they did want to help. On the other hand, they had to blame somebody, because that's what humans do, unfortunately. And so they stuck it on the immigrants. They stuck it on the urban environment. They stuck it on the poor people. And, even today, a lot of times drinking is what people do to give themselves a little anesthesia, because their situation is so bad and they just want to have relief. So it's really more of a cycle than just an individual sin problem. It can be that, but it can also be the context that you're in. You can see in these two pictures, we're seeing stuff like that now. It's maybe not as blatant, or maybe it is blatant, but unfortunately, it became a battle between immigrants versus native people, which, who's really native, right? Not us, right? We all came from somewhere else. So it became a battle between the small town and the city, between the immigrants and the people that were here longer, and so forth. So I think they had good intentions, which sometimes happens. You have good intentions, but the things you do aren't always so great to realize your intentions. So they did want to help the poor women who were not feeding the children and getting beaten up by drunken husbands. Yes. Or they bring the money home, stop using it, wasting it at the saloon. Yes, they wanted that. And they did it out of, I think, their faith. They did. But unfortunately, it's not always a perfect thing, even when we say we're doing it from our faith. And we can see this right now. When somebody's arrested for doing some heinous crime, a lot of like these shootings and all, a lot of times the people feel very self-righteous. They think they're helping. And that's why it's so hard to get through to people, because they actually feel, it's not that they may hate people, but they feel they're doing it for a good cause. That's really hard. So there's the prohibition. And as you know, the law passed, it was very unsuccessful, because I'm sure we've all seen movies about this. The rise of organized crime, more people became alcoholics because it was kind of cool. the 1920s, it was kind of cool to go to the speakeasy and have a secret password and be dressed up and, do something a little risque, right? So actually things got worse. And what the most important thing of this in terms of faith is that the church, Christianity, mostly Protestantism, felt like a failure. And so a lot of churches withdrew from social activism because they felt like they had tried, they had won, they succeeded, and everything just didn't work. In fact, it got worse. Organized crime, right? It just got worse. So for a long period of time, religion took a step back and felt like a failure. And the social activism didn't really resurge again until like the 60s and 70s. So that was a while. I mean, in history, maybe that seems like a short time, but I think they felt chastened. What about women's suffrage? Many churches were not for the vote for women, unfortunately. And I'm not saying church is bad. I'm not saying that, okay? I'm just saying we think we're doing good and sometimes it doesn't work out and we don't always have clean hands, but a lot of times we're not aware of it. Women's suffrage and religion. You see this little cartoon of women's places in her home. That was the reigning ideology of the day. There was a lot of arguments about the subordination of women being God's rule. These were justified through the Bible, like 1 Corinthians 11. I wrote a book on this verse where it says a woman should have her head covered because of the angels. What in the world does that mean? We never have figured that out. But what I discovered when I was writing a book called From Hierarchy to Equality was that biblical exegesis, which means interpretation of Bible passages, the biblical exegesis, if you follow this one issue through biblical exegesis, through commentaries that people wrote, and these are like professors and seminaries, like highly intelligent, well-meaning people, okay, that the context changed and the biblical exegesis lagged, lagged about 50 years behind. So it was like protest and question and then change. And so, for instance, in the hair issue, which is kind of related to this, bobbing your hair became a big thing in the 20s. Well, women had never done this. They didn't have short hair in America. They let their hair grow. That was a sign of womanhood. Well, when they started cutting it to be free and, be a flapper and all that, the biblical exegesis said, initially they'd say, this is an example of moral decline. Because God wants men to have short hair and God wants women to have long hair. This passage proves it. A woman should have her head covered. So it wasn't just a hat, it was the hair. So they decided that that this was part of moral decline. Do we think it's moral decline now? We have all different hairstyles here, right? And some women even shave their heads, and not just because of cancer, but because it's a style. I think it's okay. I don't think we find that to be offensive and morally decadent, but they did then. So then over time, they started reconsidering. And by the 60s, when men were growing their hair long, at first they protested that and said, oh, this is like gender problems. They lost their gender identity. And then they later on in later commentaries went, yeah, I guess it doesn't really matter. Isn't that great? So the history of biblical exegesis is fascinating when you compare it to what's going on in the culture. Okay, so religion is a mixed bag. I hope you realize that. That does lead a lot of people to want to become spiritual, but not religious. But I don't think that's the appropriate response. But we'll talk about that next week. Now, eventually women got the vote, but there was a lot of protest and resistance because women were supposed, according to Christianity, they felt women should be in the home. Look at this picture here. They think this is a mess here. Look, she's going out to business and to vote. He's home with the children and he looks like he's a victim and he's suffering. Well, now, yeah, whatever, whoever wants to bring in the money, that's good. We'll eat, the children will be fed, and whoever wants to stay home and has an aptitude, that's great, right? Or we both go out to work because unfortunately our economy has changed and you need two salaries to support a home, right?
Even the cat is horrified.
Where's, yeah, the cat's like, right, hissing. Thanks a lot, Joe, you're great. So, yeah, I mean, I could be telling jokes about this, but I take this so seriously because this is our heritage, like our recent heritage, okay? So, and we got over this, didn't we? Almost all of us, right? See, things change. And theology changes and the context changes. And sometimes theology doesn't catch up for 50 years. Okay. So this is really important for the heritage that we are, for the background of what we're experiencing today. The fundamentalist modernist controversy. I want to focus on that for a while. I went to Princeton Seminary for my PhD, and the fundamentalist controversy was really big there. In fact, there was a time when the Board of Trustees was turned over and the real conservatives were pushed out and the more liberals were brought in. And I know this is going to sound like woo-woo, but I felt you could almost feel these Machen and these other real conservative theologians. The buildings hadn't been upgraded. The pulpits were the same. I almost felt like these guys were watching us and being horrified like ghosts. I know that sounds weird, but you could feel the heritage, the fights, the brutal fights that they had right there at that school, because it was pretty much the home or the early site of the fundamentalist modernist controversy. Where does the word fundamentalist come from? Where does the word modernism come from? Well, modernism comes from the fact that in Germany, this new rise, there was a rise of higher criticism, which meant looking at the Bible, not just saying, I read it, I understand it, it's clear as day, no, but was saying, well, if, did we ever, have we studied this in the original languages? Have we done archaeology to see what they were really talking about? Have we done source criticism? Like, who actually wrote this? And then they were saying Moses didn't really write some of these earlier biblical books. And so some professors went over to Germany and brought these methods back. They wanted us to, they revered the Bible and they wanted us to understand it better. So they weren't just bringing it over to ruin the church. They brought it over because it was a highly academic, modern way to understand the Bible, and it would be better. Well, these poor guys suffered terribly. Churches kicked them out. Editorials were written against them. But in the end, higher criticism did win out because we realized it was an intelligent way to understand the Bible better. That's where the word modernism comes from. But the word fundamentalism comes from a set of pamphlets, 90, which is a lot, essays that were published and financed by a small group of people. I think they were in California. I'm not positive, but anyway, it was the series was called The Fundamentals, A Testimony of Truth. They were written between 1910 and 1915, 90 essays talking about what's the core beliefs of Christianity. What do you need to believe in order to be saved? In other words, orthodoxy, not behavior, became the test of whether you were a Christian or not. Do you hold the right views? We're seeing the same thing now today in these mono ethics, like how do you feel about abortion? Oh, okay, then you're not a Christian. How do you feel about guns? Oh, then you're not a Christian. So this making orthodoxy the test case, when you think about it, if you were a seriously ill person and you didn't have thoughts about your faith, but you still loved God, then you're not a Christian because you don't have the right beliefs, because you're not capable of holding them. Orthodoxy cannot be the only test of faith. As I said last couple of weeks ago, Tom and I have to, go through boards and make sure that we have the right beliefs in our Orthodox, because we're going to represent Christianity or Presbyterianism in the pulpit, and they have a right. It's okay, but does that prove we're saved? Maybe we're not. I think we are, but still. That can't be the only thing. What about your behavior, right? Does that matter? Can you have the right beliefs but act like a terrible person? What does that mean? So anyway, they were reducing Christianity to the right Orthodox beliefs. I still believe that as a theologian who teaches about belief, I do think right belief is extremely important, but not in a rigid way or a judgmental way. So here's what they said. Let me talk a little bit more. They were against liberal Christianity and they were against higher criticism. So this is the foundations of modern Christian fundamentalism, which we're seeing now is on the rise. And there's a lot of territory to cover between there and now, which we can do a little bit of next week. There were 64 authors. This was multi-denominational, so it was pretty diverse. They mailed them free. They mailed these pamphlets free to ministers and settlement houses and just anybody that would take it. So it obviously took a lot of money. There were 3 million volumes in the end that were actually published, and they had a lot of sway. What were they against? They were against Romanism. What does that mean? Roman Catholicism. They were against it. You couldn't be saved. In fact, as an aside, when I was, I had a conversion experience among very conservative Reformed thinkers. And I had been baptized as a child. I had chosen to be baptized in the Catholic Church. And then I kind of fell away after a point. So I returned to, or had a conversion experience. And the leader of this community I was in said, well, you have to be baptized because you need to show publicly that you've accepted Christ. And I said, well, but I was baptized. And he goes, well, okay. And this was a very famous guy. Who were you baptized? When and who? And I said, well, and when I was 8 or 7, I was in the Roman Catholic Church. And he goes, no, that didn't count. That priest wasn't a Christian. How did he know that? It was anti-Catholicism, and it was really hubris on his part. I did get rebaptized. Later, when I learned theology, it was like, oh, wait a minute, I really didn't need to be rebaptized because it's one faith, one baptism, one church. Okay. So they were against Roman Catholicism. They were against liberalism. They were against Mormonism. They were even against tradition. They thought it was just the Bible, not realizing that you're seeing the Bible through the lens of your culture and tradition. They were against Christian Science. They were against evolution. They were against Jehovah's Witnesses. They were against a lot of things. To them, it was just the Bible, but it's a naive view of Bible that you read it pure. You don't. You read it through your own personality. You read it through your context. You read it through tradition. You don't, it's not, you can't be pure. I'm so, sorry. That's just the way it is. And so they reduced the doctrines necessary for salvation as a test case. Okay. So there were 5 basic doctrines. Now, I'm not saying I disagree with the doctrines, but I disagree with the way they used it to say you were in or out, saved or not. The Trinity. I mean, I've taught courses on the Trinity. I think the Trinity is a brilliant way to understand God, but it's not like a rigid way. Jesus Christ as 100% God and 100% man. The second coming, they believed in that. And then there were premillennials, everybody was like, no, first we'll change the world, then God will make him come. No, wait a minute, he'll come, then he'll change the world. There's all these different millennial views. Salvation only through Jesus Christ sounds good, but what do we do with all the rest of the people in the world, right? We need another way to look at that so that we're not saying, well, yeah, those poor souls are going to hell, whatever, we're good. No, that's not really enough. And then they said scripture was inerrant and sufficient. Now, I learned at Princeton that scripture is sufficient for you to learn about God and find salvation, but it's not without error because it was written by humans, inspired by the Spirit, yes. And it isn't, it doesn't treat, what are we going to do about social media? What's the Bible tell us about that? What's the Bible tell us about TV? What's the Bible tell us about abortion? It's not in there. What's the Bible tell us about women's vote? It's not in there. You have to find the core principles and then apply them, yes, but not assume that the Bible is, everything is in it, because it's not that kind of book. It's not a science book. So, moving on, all these problems came to a head, and this is important heritage for today. All the problems came to a head, and as you know, we fought a war, there was a depression, I can't go through all that. Franklin Roosevelt, whom my mother revered like a saint, he was able to get legislation passed to protect a lot of things that were declining, that were horrible for people, like Social Security and all that. Well, but many churches were against what he did. And so a lot of the roots of big government is bad, and churches should do all the social help, and government shouldn't do it, and we need small government, all that has its roots in a reaction against the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt. We are living with the heritage of all that stuff I just talked about. And that is some of the roots of our situation right now. So religion and politics intermingling is not new in America. It's not new. The problems that come from it are not new either, unfortunately. Some of the benefits can come from it, yes, but it's a mixed bag. And rather than panicking today and saying, oh, this is horrible, it's never happened before, Some things have never happened before, maybe, but even a pandemic, what about the Black Plague? Some things have happened before, but our problem now has roots in all these things I've just talked about. So that's my basic message. Now, I have a request that we have a group discussion as opposed to small groups. So let's just open it up for this. And not that you have to ask me questions, just say whatever you want to say, make a comment on it, okay? So I'm opening it up for discussion. Well, maybe the small group works better for this audience. I don't know.
And the one thing that you didn't mention in the historical arc here, probably because the historical arc stopped before what we refer to as the civil rights movement, but the church did take a position. I don't know about the fundamentalist churches necessarily, but the mainstream churches took on a role
In civil rights.
in civil
Yeah,
rights
of course.
and in recognizing that we're all in this boat together.
Right.
But that was a period that obviously started immediately after the Civil War, but came to a head in 1958, 1964, and so on. I'm thinking that perhaps, and you didn't address as to, was there in the mainline churches, was there a translation of the social activism of the churches, particularly in urban environments, to legislation?
Yeah,
Was there support?
Yes, they tried.
For the New Deal?
Yes, of course. Some churches were very happy about the New Deal and they supported it and they worked to get legislation changed, which it was required to do the New Deal for all the things they changed, like the Civilian Conservation Corps, and many wonderful things came from that. And some churches supported it, maybe a lot, and some resisted it. And we're still doing the same thing now. So maybe the opening it up doesn't work for this group, but
I want to put a plug for the book.
okay.
I read it last summer, so I don't remember all the details, but I thought of it last week when we were talking about the prologue to the Civil War. It's called The Black Church. This is our story. This is our song. And you probably read it, but it's wonderful. It gives you from pre-colonial times.
Oh, that's good.
The Black Church. Henry Louis Gates is the author.
Oh,
And he grew up in a Baptist church in West Virginia. And I think that there's a parallel story.
right, of course, because they knew it firsthand. They knew the problems firsthand. Yeah.
We're not really talking about, because they didn't have the power except within their community.
Mhm.
In their community, they were extremely powerful.
Well,
I want to put a plug in.
okay, thank you. Yeah.
In response to the question, organized religion, we all live in our own little communities. And frequently the organized religion helps us see other communities. Some of us don't even know that there are homeless.
Right.
And so in that way, I think organized religion has perhaps widened our view.
Mhm. I'm not trying to put down organized religion. I'm very familiar with those people who do put it down. And I think there's a lot more nuance here than SBNRs give us credit for. A lot more. And I've been part of churches and organized religion that do want to make changes, that do want to help poor people, that do want to do all that, which I would say this church is one of them. But you just have to be honest about this diversity and array of solutions to what people either see as moral decline or suffering or whatever, So I think I probably have to let you go if you want to go to the service. So let me close in prayer, and I hope that you are enjoying the series. My main goal is to say it's a mixed bag. Okay. And it's not new. Thank you, God, for giving us each other. Thank you for giving us the church. Thank you for giving us yourself. And please help us respond to the suffering that we see and be part of the solution, not the problem. We ask you this in Jesus' name. Amen. I hope to see you next week.
Just quote me, Brett Brown.